All right, so trail braking. Before I start the show, let's just sort of talk about it. When I first wrote the book, like I said, somebody who I was interviewed by asked about the wisdom of teaching trail braking to people other than experts or racers. And the fact is that I would be irresponsible if I didn't teach trail braking because it's that important. And it's also it's counter to what the BRC, the basic rider course, tends to teach, and that's okay. That's fine, because the BRC is really intended to be just that. It's a basic. It's the first step to get you to operate a motorcycle. It's taking up more or less taking car drivers and helping them become motorcycle riders. So some of the techniques that they really need to know is to squeeze that into a weekend. I understand why they don't do it. They do start to talk about it now in the newest curriculum, but back when I was teaching it, there was really no talk about that. It was really, you get on the brakes before the corner and you get off the brakes before you start to lean in. That if you are not comfortable braking into a turn, you are increasing your risk, and of not only just it's the risk that you might be thinking of is you're increasing your risk of losing traction because you're braking and leaning at the same time. Well, that's certainly a factor, but I'm assuming that you can do two things at once and not use up all your traction. And you have to manage your traction. That's always just part of being a motorcycle rider. But if you feel as though you have to get your entry speed set before you lean in, you're committed to that entry speed. Can you then, if you have to adjust that speed around the corner to slow down again, then you're getting back on the brakes after a point where you should actually be on the gas. So trail braking, let's do this. What is it? All right, so we can just talk about what is trail braking first. And I want to differentiate that first line. Braking, it's braking into the corner, not braking in the corner. Braking in the corner is essentially screwed up and you then had to get back on the brakes. So that's when you did, what we just talked about. You get off the brakes, you're committed to an entry speed, you come around the corner, realize there's something in the road or that the corner is tightening up more than you expected, and you have to get back on the brakes or even chop the throttle, decelerate. So that's the difference. It is not braking in the corner, it's braking into the corner. How far do you brake? Up to or past the mid corner, whether you call it the apex or just the middle-ish part of the turn. Every corner is different, whether you're in a constant radius turn, an increasing radius turn, or a decreasing radius turn. That's going to it's going to determine just when you start to get off the brakes and on the gas. Another part of this that I'll talk about is that to put the whole picture together is you're braking into the corner, but then you're exiting on the gas. And so there's a transition zone in there. And that's something that you want to be as seamless as possible. And that's something that, like on the racetrack, I'm trail braking all the time, and I have to be precise about it because I'm using all the traction. And so if I'm ham-fisted with either the brakes or the throttle, that's a potential problem for sure. And so you taper off the brakes and you taper onto the throttle. So everything is if you think about curves, you don't want to add spikes of load to your chassis, to your suspension, or to your tires. So you want to always create ramps, and that's where you squeeze, you never grab. And same with the throttle, it's always a click, click. And we talk about this at track day, is where you think about the throttle as a ratchet. So instead of it being just a rheostat, with no measure, you think of it as a ratchet where you go 1 click, 2 clicks, 3 clicks, etc. And that's a way to actually think about, a way to sort of think about that ramping up your throttle. Now, again, the risk is possible traction loss. Yeah, because you are doing two things at once and asking your tires to corner and to manage some brake force. And so, yes, you have to be able to manage that. So the good news is that with trail braking, you're getting 90% of your slowing is done straight up and down. So the rest of it, that 10%, is you tapering off the brakes into the corner to about halfway around the corner. Again, give or take, depends on the radius, the type of corner. So if you're doing it with loading in that concept of ramping up your load, and then ramping off the brake load and ramping onto the throttle load, your traction management is actually, it's not a big deal. Now, if you're thinking about, well, what about in the rain, or what about in, in slippier situations? Well, yeah, you do have to be more, have to manage that even more precisely. But trail braking in the rain is actually the technique you want to use, because the other thing we'll talk about why do it is that it loads the tires predictably, and it helps kind of keep the chassis from loading and unloading with the brakes and throttle off the brakes. And so we'll talk about that in just a second. So again, it might be counterintuitive to think that trail braking is safer, and it actually helps preserve traction, and it does. But again, you have to do it with a certain level of precision. Otherwise, yeah, you could get into trouble. But you'd be surprised just how much traction there is as long as you load the tire. It's like you squeeze and then you release, and then it'll load. The tire gets pressed into the pavement. But if you hit that, the brakes hard, it's gonna slide. It's gonna break loose. So, all right. So this is a kind of complex diagram, but it shows a corner. And we'll use this corner a couple times here, but just walk through it. The red is slowing, the orange is transitioning, the yellow is now on the throttle, and the green is go. So we have the approach location. I broke this corner up with different shades of gray, and that's the approach part right there. And that's where you're going to be looking well ahead, get an idea of just how much you need to slow. You get most of your braking done right here. You can see it turns to orange almost immediately after I tip in. That's my entry where I counter steer, is right in here. And I'm immediately starting to release. So by the time I'm at full lean angle, which is going to be somewhere around here, I'm now almost completely off the brakes. So actually right in here, you can see the yellow is actually no brakes and slight throttles. That's my transition to throttle. So I'm at 0 brakes at maximum lean. So you can guess 30% here. You can actually break it down. Yet there's a lot of diagrams out there that kind of show it as 90, 80, 70, 60, 50, blah, blah, blah. But this, I just did it in color. But that's really essentially it. And so then we'll talk about why to do it and how to do it. So why to do it? We talked about a few of these things, but it's smooth and stable cornering. So how is that true? Well, let's talk about what a lot of folks do that creates a not very smooth or stable cornering situation. If you sort of jab the brakes, your chassis, it pitches forward, all right? Your front suspension compresses. If you release the brakes, it rebounds. So you've already got one, compression and rebound action going on just by braking and releasing the brakes. Now, if you then lean in, you don't notice this so much, but when you're at a higher speed or higher lean angles, when you lean, your suspension compresses. So both front and rear. So you're going to actually then it's going to load, it's going to go down like this, and then you're going to get on the gas, and then it's going to extend. So you've got a lot of, 4 different loading and unloading events. So to walk through it, it'd be like brake, compress, release the brakes, rebound, tip in, compress, get on the gas, rebound, and then off you go. So that's 4. Now with trail braking, you eliminate 2 of those because you don't get off the brakes until you transition to the throttle. So now I'm going into the corner, I brake, I get the compression event, I hold the brakes. As I lean in, I don't get that rebound. So I'm holding the brakes, and now the suspension is still compressed. Not a lot, because we're not braking hard, but even if we are, we've got it just so that it's loaded and that suspension is compressed. And as I then tip in, it stays compressed. As I then release gradually the brakes and onto the throttle, I get 1 rebound. So I get 1 compression and 1 rebound. So that's the stability and smoothness. The tires love that. The chassis loves it. So it's not only going to, if you look at the bullet points, allow you to adjust your speed accurately. It aids turn in. So that compressed suspension, it loads the front tire, which gives you more traction on the front tire. But also by compressing the suspension, it causes a pitch, the geometry of the bike to be in a state where it's actually easier to turn. So this is something that just by decelerating and then tipping in, you feel that even when you're not braking. So there's so many times when, even in my truck, I'm going down, 116 and there's an off camber turn. It goes to the right and it off cambers this way. Well, I lift the throttle when I do that. And just because if I was on the gas, the thing is going to want to push, into the oncoming lane because again, I got camber on against me. So by lifting and getting off the throttle a little bit, the truck even turns because I'm just getting that load to the front. It's very subtle, but it works. It's like if you don't do it, you're struggling to get the truck to turn. And with a motorcycle, it's even more important. So to load that front tire with a little bit of brakes, and then you tip in. So that's another thing. If you were to get on the brakes, get off the brakes, and then tip in, you don't have that advantage. The bike wants to actually stay upright, but on the brakes, light brakes, the bike will tip in easier. So I know that even Champions, the Yamaha Champion School, it seems it was, maybe not, could be stand to be corrected on this, but they've been referring to trail braking as direction control, as a direction control tool. So when you do that, again, it's a gentle loading and unloading of your tires. So control suspension travel, we talked about that already, and the reason for that, you don't want it to be pogoing up and down. And again, it gives you that predictable direction control because just like we talked about when the suspension is compressed, we get the turn in. If it's rebounding, it actually wants to stand up. So you're controlling your direction control with the brakes and keeping that suspension under control and loaded. And when it's time to accelerate out of the corner, that's when you want the rebound and the bike opens up into the corner. Again, safety. This is the bigger reason to do this is really for safety on the street because it gives you more time and space to accurately for an accurate entry speed. Like I said before, if you stick to braking and then getting off the brakes and then turning, you're now going into a corner at a speed that you hope is right, but you may not be able to see around the corner. Now, we talked about reading the road last week and the importance of that, but you don't always get it right. So you want to hang on to the brakes until you kind of get a better idea about what's going on around the corner, including if there's something in the road. So it gives you more time and space. So instead of getting off the brakes at the beginning of the turn, which I have a diagram, I'll show you this, you're carrying the brakes into the turn, you've got that much more time and space, a distance to kind of adjust. And if you need to slow down a little bit more, you're already on the brakes. You just squeeze the brakes a little more, or you just don't get off the brakes at the point where you thought, you just hang on to them a little longer. So again, it's a safety thing. And you're ready if you come around a corner and there's a mid-corner hazard, and you're already on the brakes. You just squeeze the brakes more, and as opposed to being off the brakes, come around the corner going, and then getting back on the brakes. Now you've really created a whole bunch of drama in your chassis and your tires. Okay, when do we do it? And I will talk about brakes. I think it's my next slide, which brakes and all that, how to do it. So we're doing the what, when, and how. So when do we do it? Obviously in corners. Faster approach speeds. These are ones that if you're a spirited rider, as you approach corners faster, you absolutely want to be using trail braking because you're going to approach the corner maybe a little bit more optimistic than if you're riding kind of casually. Jim likes that. Yeah, so, and you have to be able to have that margin to, if you don't get it quite right, you're still on the brakes and you just taper off the brakes. So it can be a performance riding technique. Absolutely it is. When we talk about downhill hairpins, I've actually got a diagram for this, so we'll put that on hold. Let's put a pin in that. Decreasing radius, same thing. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So these are the places where you definitely need to use it. All right, so other corners, there's a lot of corners. Most corners are not trail braking corners. When I take my students out on the street, I find the corners that are going to force trail braking. And that's because there's not every corner is a trail braking corner. Heck, not all that many corners are even braking corners. We can just decelerate. And I'm going to talk about what I call trail deceleration too, because the timing is quite the same. So it's not every corner, but these corners are ones that you better plan on trail braking for. And I have some examples of like riding in the Alps and stuff, and where, trail braking is your friend. You really have to adapt it. So again, practice, we'll talk more about that, but you have to develop the muscle memory, the timing, when you do it, how long you carry the brakes, and how, how hard, because again, you have to manage that traction. Let's see. Parking lot, we do it in the parking lot course that I run. We absolutely encourage trail braking. We get the corners, you get up to speed enough that trail braking is needed for you to execute the little road course that we put together. And always look for opportunities. This is another thing that a lot of folks, students I have, they're like, well, I don't really need to use my brakes in that corner. I said, yeah, but this is training. So I want you to approach in higher gear. So this is one that if you have a bike that has a lot of engine braking, yeah, you're going to overslow if you use the brakes on top of all that engine braking. So you just come into the corner in a taller gear. So you have less engine braking, and then it forces you to use your brakes. That's for training. And also it's not a bad idea to just, even when you do have your normal engine braking, to just get that brake light to illuminate and to get the timing of that, because the engine braking is going to be, it is braking, you are loading the front tire, but to do it with more precision, you can combine the two. Now, it might be something that, you just make sure that if you got, you have X amount of engine braking, and if you add Y amount of brake force, you're going to slow down way too much. Well, that's where you train your finger, your brake finger, and your foot pedal to anticipate that, and to give yourself the right amount of force and timing that allows you to actually execute a really nice trail braking entry with a good entry speed, not too slow, not too fast. That's how you train yourself. All right. So even if I'm on a bike that has a lot of engine braking, I always am looking to use the brakes. All right. That's because that's how you get good. Okay, here was the question that was posed. Is trail braking front brake only, rear brake only, both brakes? Yes, the answer is yes. Engine braking, yes, I'm going to say that too. I don't know anybody else that really talks about engine braking in terms of trail braking, but it is significant enough, like we just talked about. And then you taper on, you taper off, and you make that smooth transition to the throttle. That's how you do it. Now, let's back up a little bit. Trail braking has oftentimes been thought of as rear brake only. That goes back, I don't know, as long as I've been riding. And it can be. There's definitely times, examples of rear brake only trail braking would be tight U-turns in a parking lot. Yeah, that's trail braking, because you're braking into the corner and you're carrying the brakes into the corner about halfway around, and then you transition to the throttle, right? It might be a U-turn, but you're using the same technique. But I'm not using the front brake in that case, because the front brake, typically, I don't use the front brake because it's too powerful. I don't need that kind of power at 7 miles an hour. So that will be an example of a rear brake only trail brake. Front brake only is on the racetrack. That's most racers and definitely most track day riders. We use just the front brake. And that's because of load transfer. That if we're braking hard, we're going from 130 miles an hour down to 40 miles an hour, we're braking hard enough that the rear tire doesn't have good contact with the pavement. So using the rear brake would be, risk of skidding the rear tire, and we don't want to do that. So we typically just don't really use the rear brake. The only time I do that is when I have a passenger on the racetrack, and I'll use both brakes. And that's always the case. We talked about a little bit about braking a couple of weeks ago, and the rear brake has much more usefulness when you have more weight. So that if you've got luggage and a passenger, the rear brake has got a lot more usefulness, because you're not going to get that pitching forward, so that you get not a lot of rear brake, or I should say rear tire unloading. It stays loaded. Both brakes is how I brake on the street. It just, both brakes. I just do it, trail braking or not. Now I will talk more about that, in that I use both brakes in, and I come out with the rear. So at some point I release the front brake before I release the rear brake. Now that's a technique that I didn't used to do. I don't remember when I started, being more conscious of it. I think it was the first time I rode the Alps. I figured out, because it was just how many corners, how many hairpin turns can you do in a day? Well, a lot. And I had plenty of time to practice and to experiment. And this I learned later is not anything new. It's just something that doesn't get talked about a lot. It's getting more talked about now, but so, and again, I mentioned engine braking. I could call it trail deceleration, because when you think about it, you're not using your brakes when we're talking about a corner where you're not going to use your brakes. You're just going to rely on engine braking. You decelerate, that's your braking. At some point, you tip in while you're still off the throttle, and then that's your load onto the front tire. And then halfway around, give or take, when the exit appears, when you feel it's safe to do so, then you start to roll on the throttle. And there's your same sequence. It's the same thing. It's just not using the brakes doing it. But it's the same thing. You're decelerating, loading the front tire. You're getting the suspension to compress. Now it's obviously it's a lot less than if you're braking. But again, trail braking isn't braking hard. It's just braking, it's as much as you need to. And same with engine braking. You decelerate, load the front tire, you turn, you accelerate. All right. One compression, one rebound. And again, the taper on, taper off we talked about, create ramps, not spikes. And the timing. So just started talking about that. Move the slowing zone forward into the turn. And I have a diagram that talks about this. So your slowing zone is basically that as you approach the corner, it's when you begin braking and when you stop braking, when you start transitioning to the throttle. So brake early, light, and long. There's kind of sort of a phrase you can put on a bumper sticker. Reduce brake force as you increase lean. So that's when you're managing your traction. So at full lean angle, I want 0 brakes. So I'm tipping in, I might be at I could be at 100% brakes. And then as I tip in 90, 80, 70, 50, 40, 30, 0. So that's how I'm managing the traction. And at that point, that load has got my motorcycle to transition into the lean. So I don't need that load to keep it, to get it into the lean. That said, by having the brakes on still, it does keep the bike tight. Again, on the throttle, the bike's going to stand up. On the gas or decelerating, the bike's going to tip in. So you use that to your advantage for direction control. Reduce brake force as you increase lean. We talked about that. And smooth and relax. So trail braking should be more relaxed. If you get off the brakes before you turn in, you don't know, that's stressful. I don't do that. Why would you do that? Keep your brakes on, just taper them in, because it gives you peace of mind. It's a safety valve. You're still on the brakes. You can always just squeeze the brakes a little bit more. If you get off the brakes, get into a turn, then something appears that kind of freaks you out, you're going to grab the brakes and then you're going to go down. That's such a typical response, because it's a panic response. It's a human nature. You're going to grab. But if you're already on the brakes, you're going to squeeze. And even if you do grab while you're on the brakes, you're still at 20, 30% of brakes, and you give it a good grabby squeeze, you're only going to go from 30% up to say 60% instead of 0% to 60%. You follow me? So that's really the reason to do this. So let's move on to some diagrams. Okay, so this is conventional braking. This again, the red is slowing, and the transition now, the yellow, I'm off the brakes completely at this orange, and then I'm starting to transition to the throttle. Now notice there is a yellow for a long period of time, because if I get on the gas too early, I'll end up in the oncoming lane. So I do have to, this is sort of just decelerating. It's kind of limbo land. The chassis doesn't like this when you're just decelerating all the way through a curve like this. It wants to have tension on the chassis, and decelerating isn't the type of tension it wants. So this is not good technique. If you could, this could maybe be a lime green, and you could pick up the throttle a little bit earlier. You can see that lime green here. If you could carry it back a little bit, but you got to be very careful, because again, the throttle is going to cause the bike to run wide. So you've got to be real careful about that. But this is a conventional sort of beginners do this. You just brake, and then you get off the brakes, and then you tip in. This is what we want to do. Now, let me go back and forth. You see where the red extends, so that's conventional. That's trail braking. Conventional, trail braking. Okay, so now I've carried the brakes. You can see I've even carried the red into past where I'm tipping in, but it's pretty quickly turning into a darker orange, and then a lighter orange, and then lime green, and then off I go. So this is all trail braking is. It's carrying the brakes into the corner. Now this is going to help the bike stay tight. Being on the brakes is going to keep the bike staying tight. The conventional cornering here, where you're coasting, the bike isn't going to feel good. It's going to feel unstable in here. It feels stable on the throttle and on the brakes. Actually, it's stable when it's under that sort of tension. So this is going to feel a little like vague, and that's why we want to avoid that. So that's a double reason why you want to carry your brakes in. So I got very minimal time and distance where I'm in limbo. Right? I'm going kind of smoothly, just transitioning from the brakes to the throttle. Now you can actually literally overlap the brakes and the throttle here. And I do that in really tight situations where I'm actually still on the brakes and I'll take up the slack in the throttle as I'm releasing the brakes. So I don't treat the brakes and the throttle binary. I treat them as an overlap. So it's very slight. I just want to get the throttle to be ready to go as I release the brakes. And it's so buttery smooth that it's just the ultimate precision when it comes to loading and preserving your traction. All right, so this again, it's the same diagram. This is just showing a conventional braking zone. That's your approach. And then here's your trail braking. So I've given it a few different shades to just sort of give you, that's where I'm getting most of my braking done. If I'm coming into this corner at 60 miles an hour and I need to be at 30 miles an hour, I'm getting the thing to 30 miles an hour, 35 miles per hour, maybe even 33 miles per hour right here. And I'm just taking the next 3 or 4 miles per hour off over to this area right here. All right, so we're not talking drama here. It's just, you're just carrying your speed, you're elongating. Longer, lighter braking is less drama. All right, it's less stress on your tires. There's less pogoing going on. So there's an awful lot of benefit to this. But that shows you now taking a corner, and this is your transition points here, these other shades of gray. There's a decreasing radius turn. We know all about this. These are the scariest types of turns. And if this is all completely blocked, you can't see around these corners, you have to treat these, you have to treat a corner like it's a scary decreasing radius turn if you really can't see very far around the corner for very long. We talked about reading the road last time. If you weren't able to see that presentation, it's up on my YouTube channel. This one will be as well. But here we got the red, keep on the red. About here, I'm still going to be on the brakes right here. But see, I can start to see across this way. I can see around the corner now. And now I know that I can start to taper off the brakes completely. And now I'm at full lean angle right here. And now I can transition fully to the throttle. But I have to be very gentle here because I could very easily end up in the oncoming lane. So again, I'm taking that trail braking, as particularly in a really blind turn. And you want to carry that even deeper into the turn. Now, if you slow down too much, guess what? Who cares? There's no penalty for going into a corner too slow, but there is going into a corner too fast. So come in a little slower. If you're going too slow, just get off the brakes and get on the gas a little sooner. There's your fix. So don't worry about if you come in a little slow, especially if you're trying this out for the first time. You want to make sure that that you're practicing this and you're getting it to be accurate. And if you slow down a little bit too much, fine. Next time, try to get it a little more accurate, so that you're not slowing down too much and you're just getting it right. So here is going in the other direction. Now we're doing a left-hand turn. So this is the Mohawk Trail. I used this slide last year when we did this talk. This is the Mohawk Trail. That's the hairpin turn. So we're going downhill. So this is the red line is our path of travel. The yellow line is just the center line. And then this is the oncoming lane over here. And this is the Golden Eagle restaurant. Yummy place to eat, get a burger. Anyhow, back to our program. So this is where I'm putting it all into practice. I'm using both brakes to slow. This is pretty steep downhill, those of you know this corner. And so I'm going to carry the brakes longer because if I were to release the brakes right here, gravity is going to accelerate me off the road. So I want to control the effects of gravity with my brakes. Now, the steeper the corner, the more you need to rely on the brakes to control those effects of gravity. So I'm going to carry the brakes into the corner a little bit farther, and I'm going to start to release it around here. And now I'm tapering off the front brake completely. I'm pretty much at this arrow. I'm off the front brake, but I'm going to carry the rear brake a little bit longer. And now about here, I'll be completely off the rear brake. I'll likely be overlapping the throttle and the rear brake. Okay, again, for the smoothest transition, because remember that front brake can be kind of abrupt. The rear brake can't. It's kind of weak, but it has a really great role for transitioning, making the smoothest transitions possible. If you have a motorcycle that has a really snatchy throttle, that's really hard to control, fully off to then slightly on, that's where the rear brake comes in. That helps control the bike. It won't control the throttle, but it will control what the throttle does to the bike. So it'll still jump, but you're not letting it cause the motorcycle to jump. Because if the motorcycle jumps, it's going to shoot you wide. So that rear brake, I use that all the time for that reason, especially on a bike that's got a jumpy throttle. And it keeps the bike tight. Remember, that rear brake is going to keep the bike tight, to the inner part of the corner where we want to be. And again, less brake is going to cause you to go wide. And the timing, when you start to get on the gas, you get on the gas early, you're going to go wide. And that might be beneficial if there's a car coming and he's creeping into your lane. Go ahead and release the brake a little bit earlier and let the bike come out. So that's using the brakes to help you, direct your motorcycle. So anyhow, again, that's trail braking. And here's another example of that. And this is Janine going into a corner, and it's pretty straightforward. You're braking into the corner, transitioning to the throttle. That's sort of the most basic, look at it, at what trail braking is and your transition time, as opposed to having your brakes fully off all the way back here. You carry the brakes in. So again, she's getting most of her braking done. It's almost all, if she came in at 50 and needed to be at 30, she's at 35 right here. She might be 38. And then she's going to carry the brakes into here and get herself down to 30, probably more like 35 to 30 in this zone right here. And then she's going to transition smoothly to the throttle. Okay. And here's the sequence. We showed this last week, maybe the week before. And that shows the sequence of corners, and it's slow in, accelerate out. Even when you have two corners that are switchbacks that are relatively close, you still want to be transitioning and getting a load on the rear tire out of the corner. And so you're slow in and you come out on the throttle. Not a lot. Obviously, if she got on the throttle really early and hard, she'd end up by the yellow line. So she needs to do it at just the right amount of timing and intensity of the throttle. And when she releases the brakes, it all kind of comes into play right in this area. And she gets on the gas, not real hard, obviously, because she's got another corner, but then she gets back on the brakes and rinse and repeat. And I would actually do it here too. I would be on the throttle between these corners, just slightly. It would be very light, but it would be positive throttle. And it might only be one click of throttle. Like here, she might get into 1.5 clicks of throttle, maybe 2. But again, that's using the throttle and the brakes to help you actually help the bike maneuver and to steer. And it helps preserve traction. Because again, that loading is happening the way you can get away with, which is, pressing the tires in and then unloading them easily. So again, if you do it abruptly, you're going to get that traction loss. Like again, if it's pouring rain, I trail brake. I trail brake in. I approach the corner slower and I brake earlier and I just carry the brakes even longer. So it's just being as smooth and as far as loading of the tire. Spikes of load are what's going to get you into trouble. All right. So I showed this slide last week too, and this is the consequences of not using trail braking in a series of corners that are tricky and they're blind. This is the Appalachian Trail, and I was just on the side of the road taking pictures, and this guy came flying in here, and whoa, he's on the brakes now. But this is exactly what I said at the beginning of this talk, which was trail braking is braking into a curve, into a turn, not in the turn. This guy's panicking. He's in the turn going, oh my God, I'm about to go into the oncoming lane. So he's now freaking out. His chassis is all loaded up. If he was close to dragging his floorboards, now he definitely is, because again, you get on the brakes and you add lean angle and that whole chassis is going to squat. The suspension is going to compress. So, he's got himself into a pickle, because we talked about cornering lines last week. And if you were here for that, he would want to be right over here. He's nowhere near there, and he's not going to get over there. So if he were to trail brake, he would have come in and had control. And as it tightened up, he could have just stayed on the brakes a little longer and it would have kept the bike tight. And then he would have been gentle about the throttle right in here and then back on the brakes again. So when I do a sequence of corners like this, it's awesome. It's so much fun. It's accelerate, brake, turn, accelerate, brake, turn, accelerate, off we go. It's just a blast. I mean, you get it right and it's a beauty. It's a beautiful dance. So this, whoops, I'm sorry. So this shows, again, what he's doing. This is incorrect. So he kind of charged in. You see he's on green going into the corner and went, ah, and this is where he's panicking. So now he's on the brakes, right when you want to be on the gas over here, of course. But so he's just got it backwards, inverse that. Brake before the corner. The saying is you go in slower than you come out of any corner. You always go in slower than you come out. Now it can be you come out by 2 miles per hour faster, but that's still same thing. You want to come in slow and go out faster. It's just a rule that you want to follow all the time. If you come in fast and you go out slow, you got it wrong. You screwed up. Don't do that. You're going to get yourself in trouble. Okay, so here's the Alps. This is a still screenshot from a video. And this is a downhill, very steep downhill turn. And I'm going to carry those brakes all the way around the corner. If I were to let go of the brakes even here, it's still pretty steep. Gravity could very easily cause me to struggle to stay in my lane. It would want me to go off into the oncoming lane. So I'm using the brakes to keep the bike tight. And at this point, I don't need to slow anymore. So I've slowed plenty. I'm at my entry speed that I feel comfortable with. So if I stayed on the front brake at the same intensity I did back here, I would slow too much. So here's where I taper off the front brake and then I remain on the rear brake right through this section here as I then get on the gas. So turn to the left. It's the same thing. So again, I'm slowing down, tapering on the brakes, carrying the brakes. This is my most intense braking, is all done almost straight up and down. I'm still on the brakes as I tip in, but helps the bike turn in. I carry the brakes into here to control gravity because it would cause me to go off to the guardrail if I didn't control that. And I take my time, I get off the front brake and I get off the rear brake and off I go. So, I mean, if you ever come riding with me in the Alps with beaches, and this is what we do, like, blow your mind type of numbers of hairpin turns like this. And if you don't have this technique, you're going to wear yourself out. Like halfway through the day, you're going to be like, oh, I don't know if I can finish the day. And it's purely just because you're not using the right technique. You're working too hard. You're causing everything. You're not working with the bike. The bike wants to help you, but without using the brakes and the throttle at the right time and intensity, you're going to work hard. And so I think that's it, right? Yeah. Okay. So now let's see if we have any questions. So the last one was Steve. Steve had the question about front and rear brake. We talked about that. Go in with both, finish with the rear. That's sort of a general rule. And again, not every corner is a trail braking turn. Remember, I bring students to like Mount Greylock, particularly on the steep downhill turns. That's where we end up doing our practicing for trail braking. Actually, hold on a second. I'm going to share my screen again because I have a video of that. Here it is right here. Okay, this is on my YouTube channel.
Yeah, that was better. Oh, look at that. So you trusted, you dropped in and the tires did the work. Good job. Control this. Yeah, there you go. Brake, trail brake. You got lots of time. Start releasing the brakes. Don't cut in too soon, just in case a car's coming. Okay, stay wide. This one's a little trickier. Stay wide, wide. Don't let go of the brakes too soon. Okay, see, you let go of the brakes too soon, so you accelerated when you weren't ready to. Control the bike with the brakes.
Okay.
When you weren't ready to.
I want to show this.
Control the bike.
I want to show this again. So those of you know this road, this is the northern descent off of Mount Greylock, and it's one of the tighter turns. And just watch though, you can watch your brake light. It's terrible resolution, unfortunately, but watch her brake light and you'll see that she's doing pretty good. And then she needed to hold on to the brakes another 3/4 of a second or a second longer. and it would have kept her bike tight, but she let go of the brakes and it sent her wide. So watch again.
With the brakes. Stay wide. Too soon, just in case a car's coming. Okay, stay wide. This one's a little trickier. Stay wide, wide, wide.
It's a steep down.
Don't let go of the brakes too soon.
Okay, see, she's starting to accelerate right there. Now that's largely because of gravity. This is steep downhill, so she's off the brakes and watch the bike just shoot forward.
Wide, wide, wide. Don't let go of the brakes too soon. Okay, see, you did.
She stayed in her lane. That's fine, but you saw how she had to make a little correction to stay in her lane. That's what you want to avoid. And you can kind of see my bike, I'm just carrying the brakes nice and smooth, and it keeps the bike tight. And I'm aiming for my apex. My innermost part of the turn is around the corner. If you were here last week, you would know that my general rule of thumb is the apex is around the corner. And so I'm about where this rider in the black is. That's about where I would be with my apex. So I'm going to hook around and then bring it in tight. Let's see what I do.
Don't let go of the brakes too soon. Okay, see.
So you see how tight I am in here? And I was able to control it. And now I'm going to start to get off the brakes. I'll get off the front brake, probably even a little bit before here. And I'm just going to carry the rear brake a little bit longer. Probably in this case, because it's a pretty tight turn, maybe only a second. I'll get off the front brake and then get off the rear brake. And that's all I need to kind of just smoothly transition out.
You did. You let go of the brakes too soon, so you accelerated when you weren't ready to. Control the bike with the brakes.
One wants to maintain a consistent load on the chassis, tire, suspension. So begin that load with the brakes and then maintain it by leaning the bike until it's time to straighten up and accelerate. Is that one of the core concepts? Absolutely. So even if you remember your MSF class, it's slow, look, press, and roll. It's the same concept. Instead of just going slow, release, lean, and go, I'm having you slow, keep slowing, lean while you're slowing, and release the brakes, and then go. So it's just a refinement of that. But essentially, yes, as a novice, you're probably doing it already. I got to tell you, newer riders that I've worked with, they end up mistiming. The difference is that they mistime it. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know when they're doing it right or when they're doing it wrong. So it's a matter of just taking your time. No need to get off the brakes. Give yourself more time to kind of ensure that you are at the right entry speed for that corner, particularly corners you can't see around. You want to make sure that you've got that brake ready if you need it. Okay, if you release it, you've kind of taken that tool and you said, oh, I'm done with that. You've put it back in the box, and then you realize you need it again. You got to open the drawer, grab the tool again, and hurry up and use it. So you don't want to do that. So it's a matter of just kind of hanging on to that tool a little bit longer. All right, but again, the basics are, slow for the corner. Look, you're always looking. So if you're thinking of MSF, it's like look, and then press to counter steer to lean, and then accelerate out of the corner. All right. We do that on the racetrack. We do it when we're racing. It's like, it just doesn't really change. It's just a matter of your timing and your intensity of your braking and your throttling. Okay. And how quick you turn in. There's a lot of little variables, but it's all different intensities and timing of all those actions, but they're the same actions. I hope that answers your question, Jim. What effect does deceleration have on the chassis? Same as braking. So deceleration, depending on the motorcycle, some bikes have pretty heavy engine braking and others have not very much. Like two-stroke motorcycles had almost none. So you let go of the throttle and the thing just keeps going. You need your brakes harder. You need to use more brakes for a bike that doesn't have much engine braking. So it depends on the bike, but it's just like braking because it's rear tire braking. If you think about it, what you're doing is you're just causing the rear tire to slow more than the chassis, so it's like, adding brakes. So it's a brake force. So it's really no different. So the load is going to go to the front tire, just not as abruptly as if you brake, or, not as much, because you're not really braking, you're just decelerating. Now, decelerating, a lot of people rely on it. I know people that kind of proudly say, oh, I never touch my brakes. And I'm like, well, that's a shame, because you're never going to be good at braking. And also the deceleration, even though you feel like you've got complete control of it, you do, and, because it's not that hard, but you've got another tool, and that's going to help you to refine and to the tool that you need when you need it. If you're just decelerating and you need to slow more, then you have to go to the brakes. Yeah, that's what we end up doing, but that's kind of a screw up. Instead, you go in with deceleration and brakes, but very light, 5%, one finger, and then tip in. And if you need more, you squeeze more. All right. So it's really a matter of, again, how intense you want, how much you need the bike to slow. If you need the bike to slow a lot, of course, you're going to go to the brakes, but don't make it a last second decision. You want to go into it already and planning to use the brakes. All right. Like I say, if I'm on a bike with heavy engine braking, I'm still going to brake. I'm just going to do it really lightly because I don't want to overslow. Gary, hey, Gary, with ABS, can you get by with just front brakes? Here's the thing about, and you're talking about ABS, I will talk about actually a little separately than linked brakes, because that's actually more of the question when it comes to using just one brake or the other. Because with link brakes, you use the front brake, you get some of the rear brake. And so, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying there, Gary. So you're still going to get a difference of when you use just the front, you're going to get some rear, but you're not going to get a lot of rear. Same with if you use the rear only, you're going to get some front, but not a lot. So treat it as though it's separate, and you're going to get the technique is going to work for you. Now, the fact that you've got linked brakes means that they're not separated, so that, let's say you're doing the technique where you come around the corner, you release the front brake, and then you release the rear brake. That still works. It's just that you're still going to have a little bit of front brake, but it's not a lot of front brake. It's not like, hitting one brake gives you the same amount of brake force on both tires, maximum brake force. So it's proportional. So when it comes to ABS, I'll tell you about ABS. ABS is really when you're using all the traction plus. When you've exceeded the traction that's available. That's just a big screw up, right? Now, in emergencies, when you're talking about ABS, go for it. ABS is there because we panic. Deer jumps out in front of you, get the freaking thing stopped. And if you can be a pro and like squeeze it and you get the maximum shortest stopping distance without the ABS, good. We're not all pros, so you go for it and let the ABS do the work. Cornering ABS is another point that will help you if you get ham-fisted while you're trail braking. But again, and it does work. I've actually tested it. And but again, think of those electronic things as safety nets, not something that you rely on. All right, that's just in case you screw up. Don't screw up. All right, where are we at? Okay, many touring bikes have link brakes. All right, look at that. I saw that one coming. I think we can go ahead then past that. Dick, if you have any more questions about that, let me know. Warren, I noticed you didn't discuss the benefits of trail braking and traction, or have I heard incorrectly? I thought we talked about that. Maybe I can hit it again. So trail braking is going to load the tires progressively, right? You load the front tires, you go in, and you unload it smoothly as you come out. So it's going to allow you to be smooth with your brakes and your throttle. Remember, brake early, long, and light. That's going to preserve traction. Again, in the pouring rain, I'm trail braking. I'm just doing it earlier, lighter, and longer. Well, maybe not so much longer, because I want that the timing of when I release the brake is going to be about the same, about halfway around the corner. But I'm going to absolutely I want that whole chassis to just gradually load in and gradually unload, all right, on the throttle. So traction and trail braking go hand in hand, absolutely. Again, for the reason also is that I don't want to go into the corner too fast. I don't want to be at a speed that I feel uncomfortable with halfway around the corner. So I come into it and I'm like, oh, I think I'm okay here. And I release the brakes and I come around. It's like, oh my God, I got that one all wrong. Then you got to go back to the brakes. Now you're going to use up a lot of traction, because now you've got, like I said before, you're at zero brake force, and you're going to probably over brake because we get panicky and we grab. So now you're going from zero brakes to 60% or 80%. Now you've got a big load. Now that's going to cause you real trouble. Not only with the tires, getting a load, but that chassis is going to slam, and you're going to lose ground clearance. You're going to lever your bike off the ground. It just goes bad. So just keep the brakes in, load the tires, and then unload them gradually. All right, so I think I covered that, Warren. See, I think we've got one more question. Is everything the same with linked brakes? Okay, we talked about that. All right, well, I guess nobody else has any questions. I hope you come to the talk if you're in the Western Mass area. Actually, Christopher's got a question, so we'll go back here. I have trouble getting good feel from my rear brake as my boot insulates my foot from the pressure. Obviously, practice will help, but other ideas? Yeah, I mean, every bike's different. One of the things, and boots, one of the things I do pretty quickly when I'm riding a new bike to me, is that I'm going to feel the brakes. That's what I do first off. And then I do tight U-turns. But I want to feel where the brakes are going to come on, where the power is, and particularly, and both front and rear brake. So it does, you're right, Christopher, that it is just a matter of kind of getting a feel, but being conscious of it. That's the thing that a lot of people don't do when they ride, is not very mindful. And so then we end up doing things just like the way we've always done it. And so we kind of feel like maybe in this case that, well, yeah, my big boots and my brake pedal and all that, the combination just gives me lousy feel. I guess that's just the way it is. And to some degree it might be, but you can work with it. You get a sensitivity as far as how much you need to apply the brakes to get the result that you're looking for. So, but yeah, every bike and riding gear, they all have some limitations to them. When I have a favorite pair of gloves when I'm on the racetrack, and I have my backup pair of gloves, which are fine, but there's a difference. And I notice the difference, the feel in the lever, right at where I need it to feel to that high degree, it's different. And so you just kind of try to get used to it as quickly as you can and ride within the limits. If you really have a big problem with those boots and that rear brake, know that that's a problem. That's a limit. And if you can fix it, great. If you can't, it's just a limit you have to live with. Okay, let's see. All right, I guess we're good. So my wrap up here is that hopefully if you're in the Western Mass region, you'll come by Indian of Springfield on Saturday. I think it's, we're doing it at, I don't even remember, 11 o'clock. And again, it's not at the dealership, it's down the road at their little warehouse. Come kick some tires, look at the bikes, and see you then. I do have my 2023 calendars up on ridinginthezone.com. And I'm filling up my street courses and the parking lot courses. Track days filling up. I've got maybe 2/3 full on the May track day. And the August is doing pretty good, about 1/3 full. So those are all open, ready to be signed up for. If you have any questions at all about any of the courses, you know where I'm, Ken at ridinginthezone.com. All right, if everybody's good.
Perfect.
Okay, we got
Thank
another.
you very much, Ken.
All right, Bob. Thanks a lot, man. Thanks, Jim. I'll talk to you all later. Bye.
Yep.